The CCAT is one of the many tools we have to monitor students' ability and to get to know them as learners. Educators should understand the assessment, what it is and what it measures, and respond to the outcomes of the assessment, including communication among administrators, teachers, and parents. I hope this video will deepen your understanding about the assessment and provide some examples of best practices after you receive the results in June. The CCAT was brought into the Waterloo Catholic District School Board years ago in response to trustees asking if we were doing enough for gifted learners. Research is telling us that they are not graduating and they're having difficulty with boredom in the classroom. The CCAT was chosen because it's easy to administer by teachers and efficient to analyze. Grade 4 was chosen because at this age, students can provide reliable and valid responses on a self-report assessment. The CCAT measures 3 different areas of cognitive reasoning or thinking. The first one being verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal. Initially, the Waterloo Catholic District School Board used the CCAT assessment as a screener for giftedness and for academic and learning problems or delays, and for the investigation of learning styles. Shortly after, we realized that this rich assessment was good for all, and so all students in grade 4 at the Waterloo Catholic District School Board are invited to participate in this assessment. The CCAT assessment is a standardized assessment which takes the students' responses and compares them to a random sample of grade 4 students, which is referred to as a sample population. It's kind of like a bell curve. We have seen bell curves before when we look at IQ scores. This is very different than a standards-based assessment where the student responses are compared to a relative standard. So for example, when we evaluate the Ontario curriculum, we're comparing it to a standard. The same with EQAO and CAT4. So because the CCAT is a standardized test, we need to re-norm that sample population every 8 years because children change over time. And as you can see, it's been over 20 years since the last norming was completed, which is why in 2018 we brought in the CCAT version 7 so that we would have that comparison to a more recent population of students. So all grade 4 students are administered the CCAT 7 assessment in the spring of each school year by the classroom teacher. Unlike the previous version of the CCAT, the new CCAT 7 has specific accommodations that are available to students who are supported with an individualized education plan and/or students who are English language learners. So it's really important to note the accommodations that are available on this new CCAT. As well, to create an assessment that is generally more accessible to English language learners, very little reading is actually required in the nonverbal and quantitative batteries. And so for students who are ELL, it's really important to note that the nonverbal and quantitative batteries are still accessible for them. Many of the manual administration processes are reduced due to the addition of the student identification label, and I'll talk a little bit more about that label later on in the video. Unique ability profiles are also now automatically created for each student and can be retrieved using the CCAT.com website. The CCAT can be used, again, it measures thinking. We always think that when we evaluate the curriculum that we're evaluating thinking, but we're actually surmising thinking. And the CCAT is designed to actually measure thinking across those different reasoning categories. And sometimes as teachers, we can apply some bias that we have when we assess. So the CCAT really does a great job of both measuring thinking while still understanding that it's a standardized assessment. It is also a screen for giftedness, as I've mentioned before, and for academic and learning problems or delays. And the most important information that we get from the CCAT can be found within the comprehensive learning styles that are produced at the end of the CCAT. So the best way to get acquainted with the assessment is to take a look at those sample questions that appear within the administration guide. And you'll notice that each question in every section is sequenced such that the first few questions are very easy and they progressively get harder and harder. And that is very consistent with a standardized test where eventually students will hit a ceiling, after which they typically will not get very many questions correct. The three batteries, as I've mentioned before, are the verbal, the quantitative, and the nonverbal batteries. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about each of those batteries. So the verbal battery is the section that measures a child's ability to remember and transform sequences of English words, to understand them and to make inferences and judgments about them. So it's really using words to solve and think through different problems utilizing language. And the subtests within the verbal battery are the verbal analogies, the sentence completion, and the verbal classification. So if you haven't taken a look at the test, here's some examples of two of the subtests. So the verbal analogies, the question might read, white is to snow as black is to. Is it A, brown, B, bronze, C, rain, D, coal, or E, clouds? And so we can see that in this instance, the correct response is D, coal. Verbal classification requires the student to look at a group of words and then come up with a rule and then select the fourth word that would be included in that rule. So Indian, Arctic, Atlantic, the correct response would be either A, African, B, Asian, C, Australian, D, Pacific, or E, polar. So in this question, because the Indian and Arctic and Atlantic words all represent oceans, we would select D, the Pacific Ocean. The next battery is referred to as the quantitative battery, and the quantitative section measures a child's understanding of basic quantitative concepts and relationships. And the subtests in this section are number analogies, number puzzles, and number series. On this next slide, you'll see examples of these three different subtests, all requiring the student to look for patterns and think through rules and coming up with a response that correctly matches the rule from the information above in the question. The third battery is the nonverbal battery, and it measures reasoning using pictures and geometric shapes. The subtests in this area are referred to as figure matrices, paper folding, and figure classification. So we can see examples of the figure matrices. It uses shapes and looks at how those shapes are manipulated or changed, and then applying that rule to come up with the correct response. Similarly, in figure classification, looking for the rule that would group those first three figures together and then which matching figure would be the correct response. The next part of the video will review some frequently asked questions by educators as they plan to administer the CCAT. So the CCAT measures, again, the learned reasoning abilities or the thinking within these different three symbol systems, the verbal, the quantitative, and the nonverbal. And these three batteries are chosen because they are most closely related to success in school. It's important to note that in previous years, each of the batteries had a different length of time, but in this new version of the CCAT, it is a consistent time of 10 minutes for each subtest, totaling 30 minutes for each battery. The three batteries should be administered over 3 days, so it's important to plan for that during the administration time. Before the test, it's always important to get ready and get organized. First, look at who will be participating in the CCAT assessment to ensure that you understand which notifications need to be sent home and what accommodations need to be planned for. Letters are created and distributed to principals so that they can be sent home to families, notifying them of this assessment. And it's important to prepare the student answer sheets. New to the CCAT 7, the teacher simply needs to apply a student identification label to each answer sheet and just check the student participation list that it's accurate. Of course, always make sure that you have everything you need in your bin prior to the test so that you don't have to worry about finding a pencil or not having enough test booklets. So the student identification sheet looks like this. You'll see that traditionally we would bubble in all of the responses or all the demographic information. Now you'll see that we have a label that is printed and prepared by the board office. And so you simply need to find the label and attach one label onto every student answer sheet as indicated in the slide. It's really important to understand that if for some reason there isn't a label for a student, so perhaps a student is new to your school, simply write in the information in the area that the sticker would have normally been applied, and that's all you need to do. You don't need to bubble anything in on the front page. On the back page, all you simply need to do at the top is to bubble in level 10. So that will just ensure that the student responses are compared to the grade 4 normed population. So another question that we often get is whether or not students with an IEP should write the CCAT 7, and we want to ensure that any assessment data that's generated from the CCAT is going to be an accurate and valid measure of the student's thinking abilities. So the principal, in consultation with the classroom teacher and special education teacher, will decide on the appropriateness of the CCAT 7 for students who are on IEPs. And in some instances, perhaps some or all of the batteries would be exempt for a student if we know that we won't learn anything new from this assessment. Again, I've mentioned before that new to the CCAT 7 are the addition of accommodations. Because the assessment measures thinking and not skills, such as reading and comprehension, these accommodations do not actually reduce the validity of the assessment. So it's important to refer to that direction for administration guide on pages 5 through 7 for accommodations related to students with an IEP. So it's again important that these accommodations are only provided to students that currently have an IEP and are marked in Trillium as having an IEP, and we only want to utilize the accommodations that are listed in the CCAT administration guide. So there are some accommodations such as using a calculator that may appear in an IEP, which is not allowed as an accommodation on the CCAT 7. So double check that accommodation list in the CCAT guide. We also want to ensure that the accommodations that are used for the CCAT 7 are the accommodations that are regular and recurring in the regular classroom assessments. The maximum time is double. And so that is the maximum time that we're able to provide students if they have that accommodation within their IEP. And as I mentioned before, calculators are never a possible accommodation because it interferes with the validity of the mathematics or the quantitative section. So here's a list again of the accommodations that are allowed for the CCAT, and we want to make sure that these accommodations are regular and recurring in the classroom and are listed on the student's IEP. So we want to make sure that, you know, the accommodations are done in a unbiased way. So again, if we were to read this verbal analogies question, we would just say white is to snow as black is to brown, and we would say A, brown, B, bronze, C, rain, D, coal, and E, clouds. The non-example of a read aloud, we wouldn't want to be leading the student to pick a particular answer. So we wouldn't want to say Indian, Arctic, ooh, Atlantic. Those all sound like bodies of water. Is it A, African, B, Asian, C, Australian, D, Pacific, and E, polar? So we want to make sure that we're unbiased in those accommodations. For students who are English language learners, again, there is a guide in that test administration guide, pages 5 and 8 for the approved accommodations for students who are English language learners. The last part of this video talks about what to do with the CCAT data. And so it's really important that when you get the information in June, that you really use that information to precisely program for each student. The heart of our BIPSA is to know the learner through assessment and to respond through effective instruction in learning environments. And typically when we get to know our learners, we look at all sorts of different types of information to really understand who they are as a learner and what their strengths and needs are. And the CCAT data provides a valid and standardized measure of thinking to educators, which is an additional layer of information for them to really get to know their learners. Your data analysis, your school should receive the results by the end of June from the board office. And so all of the information that you need will come to you soon. There are a variety of hard copy reports that are provided to schools, and I'll go through each one of these reports. There's multiple reports that are either stored in the OSR or are provided to the parent. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can access the information through Encompass or through the Ability Profiles website. So this first report is called the Student Profile, and it's stored in the OSR, and it contains all of the demographic information for the student, the age percentile rankings for each battery. So you'll see a numeric score from 0 to 99 for each of those batteries, and it also includes the ability profile in the top left-hand corner. And the ability profile score is based on all of the score information for the student, and it's automatically created so that you can just simply look it up in the website. So the website that we're going to use to look up that ability profile code is called www.cogat.com, and you simply take that ability profile code. In this example, it's 9 capital E V minus. So when you go to the website www.cogat.com, you'll be asked to enter in the parts of the code related to the STAY9, the profile, and relative strengths or weaknesses. And so you'll look at the number STAY9. In our example, we would put in the number 9. In the profile, right, we would put in the letter code for the profile, and then if there's a relative strength, it would be a letter with a positive score, and then relative weakness, a letter with a negative score. So just a little bit of dissection. You don't need to really understand how the ability profile is created, but just know that that first STAY9 score determines the overall ability of the student. STAY9 9 would be, if you see a 9 at the beginning of the profile code, it means that the student is well above average. 7 or 8 would be above average. STAY9s 4, 5, or 6 would be average, and then STAY9 2 or 3 would be below average, and STAY9 1 would be well above average. And then what you'll see is the profile code, so whether the profile is A, B, C, or E. If the profile is A, it means that the 3 battery scores are about the same level, so they're very close together. A shape profile of B would mean that one score is above or below the other 2, which would be very similar. A shape profile of C means that there would be a substantial contrast between the 2 scores, so there isn't really a relative strength or a relative weakness. The 3 scores would be quite different. And then if you have a shape profile of E, it means that there's an extreme difference between 2 or more scores. And then any of the V, Q, or N with a plus or a minus symbol indicates the battery that is relatively high or relatively low. So the parent copy looks very similar to the OSR copy, except for the fact that these two areas are removed on the parent copy. There's no ability profile score provided to parents, nor should that ability profile score be given to the parent. It can be used by educators to inform the conversation with parents. As well, the composite score is also not provided to parents. The parents will also receive a CCAT parent guide, which looks something like this. It's basically a brochure to support parents in understanding how to read their child's report. So inside the guide, it goes through just what the different batteries are with a brief description. It gives a sample student profile and then talks a little bit about how to interpret those age percentile ranks compared to this bell curve distribution. And so this information accompanies their letter. Administrators will also receive a report called the Student Roster Report, and what this report shows is a list of all of the students line by line and their verbal, quantitative, nonverbal, and composite scores. And you'll see in the very last column that the ability profile score is there as well. So this might be a handy report to look at all of the scores together. When you receive this report, and if you're using this report, I always like to color code so that I can see where my students are at with respect to that bell curve distribution. So the first thing that you can do is you can use a pink or a red highlighter to highlight any scores between 1 and 24. You could use a blue highlighter to highlight any of the scores between 25 and 75, which is in the average range. And then any scores that are above 76, you could highlight green, which indicates that they're at the above average range. And then because this is a profile for gifted learners, I also like to circle any scores that are either 98 or 99. And so at the individual level, you should look at row by row and think of, if students do have a red or pink highlight, ask yourself if they already currently have an IEP, perhaps who they are, and are we accommodating for them? Another question I always ask myself is at the individual level, if I see a student that has both a red and a green highlight, just asking myself why is there a discrepancy, and whether or not further assessment needs to take place. And then if you have students, like in this example, with 2 or more batteries where they have a circled score either in the 98th or 99th percentile, then the question would be, are they gifted? And so does an IEP need to be developed? When looking at this information at the class level, it really helps us to look at the instructional strategies that would be appropriate. And so if we look down the verbal column in this example and see that there is some strength, either blue highlights or green highlights in the verbal battery, that it would be appropriate to talk and verbalize instructions and content to students. But we wouldn't want to be in a situation where, we perhaps might have a group of students in our class in a particular cohort that is really weak in the verbal battery. And so we would not want to be talking to them if they're not strong in that area. And so perhaps you might have a cohort that has a significant strength in nonverbal, and so perhaps utilizing a map or other visual cues to inform directions or content might be more appropriate. Looking at some of the ways to utilize some of the electronic resources, the CCAT scores are available in Encompass for Success. The first thing you need to do after you log into Encompass for Success is to identify and select your class. Then what you would do is under the assessment pull-down menu, you would select CCAT. And then you would select all categories under the CCAT pull-down menu. And then what you can do is you could either take a screenshot, or use the print view feature to print and download this. In this example, I've gone through my screenshot and highlighted, as I demonstrated in the previous slide, if students are below, at, or above average, using the red, blue, and green color codes. You can also access the CCAT data at the student level on the student profile page. And so once you click on the name of the student from the school, from the class profile page, you simply click on their name and select the tabular tab. Then you would select other assessments, and then you can find the CCAT scores listed in the table below. Once you've color-coded the APR scores, or the age percentile rank scores, it's important to know how to use them to inform the next steps. And I'll just let you know that your special education teachers and your special education liaison teachers are always willing to work with classroom teachers to extend the learning for these students. So if you have students that are scoring between the 92nd and 98th percentile, they are considered to be Tier 1, classified as bright and talented. And in this case, no IEP is needed. However, there might be some additional programming that would be of interest and of use for these students. For students that score in the 98th percentiles in 2 or more batteries of the CCAT, they would be classified as Tier 2, and the next step would be the development of an IEP for a gifted label. And so it's really important that additional assessments follow the CCAT. The CCAT will flag whether or not a gifted IEP might be required. However, assessments such as the WISC might identify the precise areas of giftedness to inform the accommodations and modifications. For students that score within the below the 25th percentile, we really want to understand their abilities, and we would want to engage in some further assessments. In some cases, an IEP might already be developed, and in other cases, it might be a flag for the development of an IEP. I always get questions about, for students that do score quite low. Hopefully for educators, this won't be new information for anyone at the school. And, it's really important to note that if this is the first assessment that would flag this student, it could be for a variety of reasons. Of course, in any assessment, teachers should be journaling or documenting anything that's abnormal during the administration of the assessment. So if a student falls asleep or is disengaged, it really helps to interpret some of these outlier responses. Or perhaps, students are really good at faking it, right? So they sometimes, with the amount of group work that they're doing, maybe you're not recognizing that there is a weakness in a particular area. And so the CCAT might be the first assessment where this would be flagged. So it's just really important to understand the profile. Again, further assessments may be required to really identify the underpinnings of this weakness. Of course, through everything, we need to communicate with parents so that they're knowledgeable about the next steps. Sometimes, there's always that question of, what if a student does classify for a gifted profile? Although it's not required, it's strongly recommended that a gifted IEP be developed because of all of the research that we know that students that are gifted experience fewer and lower outcomes compared to students that are not. And so we just want to make sure that all of the supports are in place for these students. Sometimes when we identify students who are score in the 98th percentile or above, it doesn't match how they're achieving in the class. And so, you know, we might have a student that really is a level 2, level 3 student that we would never have predicted would score so high on the CCAT. And it's really important that to know that it's a myth that all gifted students achieve level 4 or above. And some do and some do not. And we just want to make sure that we understand that, you know, the CCAT is measuring thinking, and that's not the same thing as all of these skills and curriculum and knowledge that's being assessed in the classroom. So we know from the research that some students underachieve, that they are at risk from not graduating secondary school, and there are in fact some profiles of students who are gifted and that also have a learning disability. So again, we just want to make sure that we're supporting these students in every way we can. The second question, or the next question that I get, is whether or not special education teachers need to complete an educational assessment with students with really high or really low scores. And it should be considered for students whose scores indicate the possibility for the need of an IEP. Remember that the CCAT really identifies or flags students that we might need to take a deeper look at in terms of their learning profile. APC 026 would be the policy also related to this area. So the impacts, when you receive the results in June, you should spend some time to understand the scores and the impact on the school. The learning styles in that ability profile code is presented and appears on the student profile, and we should be looking at how it impacts programming, instruction, and assessment. Students that are able to modify their learning style as they mature and gain experience in a range of learning methods. And so we want to make sure that we understand that this is a snapshot in time and that learning styles can change. It's also necessary for students to develop alternative learning strategies and thinking skills. So although I may not have strength in the nonverbal battery, there are ways that I can develop those skills and use them efficiently and accurately to engage with the curriculum later on. Again, we want the auditory learner will periodically face problems that require hands-on solutions. So again, just being mindful that knowing that depending on if you have one particular learning style or the other, that there might be some situations where you would want to support them in different ways. So thank you for watching this video. I hope that some of your questions were answered, or you have a deeper understanding of the CCAT assessment. If you still have questions related to the CCAT, with respect to the reports, just contact your school principal. They'll have the reports and might be able to answer your question. With respect to programming, the principal, the spec ed teacher, and the board office itinerant teacher or a special education liaison teacher will be able to help. And if it's related to accessing the information on Encompass, you're welcome to use the online live chat. So thank you very much, and have a great day. So the video's 33 minutes. I can't send that for a staff meeting. The CCAT, and then I have to do one for Cat 4. Like, that's way too long. But normally this is a 2-hour training session. So I trimmed it enough, but that's not far enough. Anyway, sorry.